first of all, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And it's really wonderful to see you and be amongst you once again. I've been doing this for a long time, and it seems like it's been forever, but I guess I'm coming down to the end of the trail, and I look forward to any opportunity to get together with people like yourself that are so dedicated to what it is you're doing. To be here. One thing that I do notice is that there are so many women in the audience. There was a time in art education when it was fairly well balanced with regard to male and female. But the females always do hold out, perhaps have the most impact in art education anyhow. But before we begin, I want to pay tribute to a few people that are here in the audience. First of all, to my colleague and former colleague, Beth Cornell, who was with the Department of Education for a number of years and still keeps herself very active in arts education. And I want you to meet and greet Bill Dallin, who sits over here right beside Beth. Bill and I were colleagues in the Department of Education going back to 1963 and 64. Bill was the old beat-up English teacher who came to the Department of Education as the English advisor and then became the coordinator of federal programs. And he had a very important job in the Department of Education with regard to forming what we know of education today in the schools. And beside him is his wife, Mary Lou Dallin, who you all probably know for her seminal work with regard to the arts and special education. Her work was especially with autistic children and other youngsters that have problems of that sort has been really wonderful. Mary Lou and I go way back. She's a graduate of Moore College of Art, if any of you know that place out in Philadelphia. Welcome to you all, and I am especially pleased to be here on this morning. Beautiful day, I guess. When I drove across the Harvey Taylor Bridge coming in, that's the big bridge on the north side of Harrisburg, and looked at the skyline. I'm always impressed by that. That's what greeted me every day on my way into work, and I was so impressed by that, and being here in the Capitol. I want to start off by commenting on a few things, readings that I would recommend to all of you. First of all, a recent book by David Brooks on character. And David Brooks, as you know, is a columnist with the New York Times. He leans on the conservative side of the New York Times, which is a difficult job. And his book on character is one that I would highly recommend to you. Another is a book by Joseph Ellis, who's recently written a book called The American Sphinx, or The Character of Thomas Jefferson. And the reason that I relate to both of these books, especially to David Brooks, is that he puts a strong emphasis upon people like yourself, keeping in mind not so much your resume, but your eulogy, as to who are you and what do other people think of you. And I can guarantee you that if you are involved deeply in arts education and you do your job, that you're going to be remembered by a lot of people. And your character means a lot. And that is always in the works, believe me. So the importance of character in the course of being an art educator is highly important. And the people that I've referred to here already are, I think, shining examples. There are many others that I know most of you have met in the various colleges that you've worked with and the various programs you teach with, and some of your colleagues. I started off teaching out in the western part of Pennsylvania. My wife Barbara and I were teachers, the first art teachers in the North Allegheny School, which is a big deal district out in western Pennsylvania now. And we opened that school district together in a brand new school. It was quite an experience. And after a lot of time and a lot of work, I ended up at the University of Pittsburgh teaching there, and came out here in Harrisburg at the invitation of the Scranton administration, which goes way back into the 1960s. But when I arrived on the scene here in Harrisburg, to work with what was then called the Department of Public Instruction, or the DPI, not the PDE. It was a program that was, a government agency that was somewhat set apart in government and really wasn't so much controlled by the governor's office. And now that's the opposite has happened. Around 1969, the old Department of Public Instruction became the Department of Education, and then sat on the council of the governor, and was very much involved in politics, and a lot has happened since then. Way back then, the largest part of the state budget was set aside for education. As a matter of fact, it was well over 50% of the state budget. It's a little different nowadays, and things are really struggling with regard to the cost of education and where that money is coming from via taxes and everything else. And you'll be sure to hear more about that in weeks to come as the state budget is wrestled with and eventually passed. But when I came to the Department of Education in 1963, 1962, one of the first persons I met was Bill Dallin. And Bill and I, we were in different divisions of the department, but we immediately struck up a friendship with regard to our purposes, because Bill, as I said, was the English advisor. And he had been off to Colorado in a special grant, federal grant, which put him on a humanities track. And our friendship over the years has really developed into one that was very close and personal. But in addition to that, we kept one another in check with regard to who we were and what we were trying to do. And one of the things that I was trying to do was to articulate what art and art education is all about and how important it is to my vision at that time. And I can tell you that a lot of people had no reason really to listen or to believe what I was trying to say. And Bill was one that would say to me, Clyde, stop talking with the stained glass window down in front of you. Speak in a way and write in a way that I understand what you're doing, and I'll do my best to support you. And that was a tough job. And believe me, before I left the department, one of the strongest supporters of arts education in the Department of Education, as far as I was concerned, was Bill. And he even married an art educator to prove it. I was their best man.
So, what was meant by the stained glass window?
Well, it really meant the fuzziness of thinking and the indirectness of speaking. Talk about art education like everybody understands what the value of it is. I can tell you that when I was a youngster in school, we really didn't have much art. As Osborne commented, he said that art in those days was something for the tag end of Friday, to reward you if you were a good kid and throw you a few crayons and keep you busy. And that's basically what it was. In a school district like the one that I attended, at least. Some of the cities and some of the places that were a little bit different, there were other things happening, but for the vast majority of people across this country, an art education experience wasn't much. And it goes way back into the 1800s and the early 1900s, even in this state, where the purpose of art in the schools was really to help you become, to create a better household. It was very closely related to home economics and industrial arts. And I told Paul here not long ago, one of the biggest conferences held in this state was held up in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, with art educators, but it was really home economics and industrial arts all together. And it was really to teach people how to choose colors for their clothing, how to make various basic things. But then during the 1920s, there was an interest that really stirred things over in Europe. It had to do with the interest in human development and psychology. And that also related to art. And as you know, in the 1920s, the Bauhaus program began in Germany and in that part of Europe. But then Hitler came along and booted most of them out. A good many of them came to this country, including a man by the name of Victor Lowenfeld, who ended up at Penn State. And Rudolf Arnheim ended up at the University of Chicago, and there were many others in various places. Joseph Albers at the Black Mountain College in North Carolina. But they had powerful impact on arts education. And so in the 1920s and the 1930s, this whole issue of beginning to understand how art really impacted human development and how important that was with regard to healthy lifestyles of everybody across the country, and an increase in the contributions that artists and young people could make through their lives into the betterment of what this nation is all about. That had a big impact here in Pennsylvania. And there was an early curriculum document developed back in the late 1930s and the 1940s that we refer to as Bulletin 262. Any of you familiar with that? No? Well, it was a blue and white document that everybody thought was a big deal. What it did is lay out very basically what an art teacher was all about. At the elementary level, if you were an elementary art teacher, you were a rare bird, because for the most part, elementary art was taught by elementary teachers, and elementary teachers were certified to teach art, regardless of the fact of how much background they had in it. Music, too. So they would encourage an elementary teacher to be able to play the piano or strum on the guitar or something like that to lead kids in singing. And with the art part of it all, it was rather simple at the elementary level. So Bulletin 262 lasted quite a long time, and when I came into office, people would say to me, when are we going to update Bulletin 262? We need you to write a curriculum. So one of the first things I did...
So Bulletin 262 was the standard policy at that point?
It was a basic policy.
When you got here,
that's right.
Ripe to be changed, obviously. So what was the other policy in place for art education in Pennsylvania?
The only other thing would have been the school law.
Okay.
And that's a step above policy. School law is law. And the law required art to be taught to elementary students, required to be taught to junior high students, and required to be offered at the high school level. So that meant that we had to prepare teachers for that. And that is what happened over the course of the years. There were three major schools in the state that were state teachers' colleges that taught arts education, as in addition to Penn State and Temple University and Moore College of Art, and a few small schools like that. But it was Indiana, Kutztown, and Edinburgh were the leaders. And they had to really turn their programs around quite a bit to adjust to what was being required and what was being expected with regard to the development of programs, especially after World War II. And during World War II, a lot of people like myself and Bill over here took advantage of the GI Bill and went off to school, and a good many of us became art educators for one reason or another. The big reason I did was because I met my wife when I was interviewing for the program. I wanted to be an architect originally.
And by that time, the impact of Arnheim, Lowenfeld, and Albers had pretty much gotten into the...
That's exactly right.
Art ed atmosphere, or just art in America in general, and
very far.
So you had some leverage to start really writing curriculum that had
Exactly.
something to do with intellectual development of students and that sort of thing in schools. Is that
absolutely?
That all came together?
And it was not just an ordinary impact; it was powerful. At Penn State, Victor Lowenfeld was really created a program together with a young art teacher from Harrisburg originally. His name was Kenneth Violet, who went on to Carnegie Mellon, and he came back up to Carnegie Tech at that time, then back to Penn State, where he helped Victor with the development of that program, which most of the graduates that came through that program, a good many of them GIs who came back to get their degrees, and then they spread across the country and created programs out in California, Texas, Florida, everything else. So there was a powerful influence across the nation of Pennsylvania art educators really led through that. That, I think, is still going on to some degree. In addition to that, I should say that a great many of the art educators across the country were educated in Pennsylvania schools, because many of the states beyond Pennsylvania did not offer art education. or did not offer certification for art students of the quality that Pennsylvania did. So Pennsylvania teachers were sought all across the nation. Beth here ended up all over the world, and especially out in California.
So after that process was established in the state, you were making inroads with policy at the state level, Department of Ed. How were teachers teaching at that point, and what was the atmosphere for the state of teachers in the classroom?
It was a real mixed bag.
As far as art education.
I've got to be honest with you. In those days, we'd drive all over the state, drive and fly all over the state. I visited most every little town and school district in this state. I don't think there's one that I missed. And it was a real mixed bag. From incredible quality and deep dedication to people that really didn't know what they were doing. I'd go into an art classroom and open up the storage room doors or something like that. Things are in terrible disarray. And one of my favorite comments is the way rulers were used for paint stirrers or scissors were used as pliers and things like that. It was really not a good case to be made. So from a policy point of view, in terms of art education, it was my job to try to get back somehow or another and tell it like it is to a lot of the art educators that were leading college programs around the state. And there were some that listened, and a great many more that didn't, quite frankly. And what was happening then, too, was a disparity between what was going on with teaching in the colleges and universities. That disparity had to do with, do you want to be an artist or do you want to be a teacher? And if you want to be a teacher, you were down here, and being an artist was up here. And that still exists in some of the colleges, and for reasons that I cannot understand, because a good many of the art educators that I know are doggone good artists too, and have a good feel for what's going on in the world of art. And that does not mean that any of you must aspire to be an artist, but it sure helps. But more importantly, I think what really helps is the heart of it all, and the understanding of what it all means. That was happening. And a lot of that has changed. And I know that in a lot of departments, in art education departments across the state, there's a lot more equal treating of one another. But anyhow, that was a problem. And I think that continues to be a problem, but not so much as it was then. With regard to policy and my efforts, if I look back at it, my personal thought about it is that, gee, it was pretty weak. I really didn't understand the importance of policy. And policy is, the sort of the rules, sometimes written, most of the time unwritten, as to how you operate. And so it was, as soon as I began to catch on to that, one of the things that I did in the Department of Education was to make an effort to make my rounds of the other advisors in the state. I would take time every day with a cup of coffee or something like that, and walk around the department and stop in an office, let's say of the mathematics advisor, and say, what are you doing? And they would tell me, and I'd say, I don't understand, tell me again. And they'd tell me again, and I'd say, I still don't understand what mathematics is, tell me again. They say, come on, McGeary, are you some kind of an idiot? You know what math is. I said, no, tell me. Pretty soon I began to understand in their language, because what I was doing was pressing them in their language to be clear in what they're saying and to how deserving they are of the time that they take up in the curriculum. When they began to tell me that it was really understanding relationships, spatial or numerical relationships, I said, gee, we do some of that in the art room too. As a matter of fact, I know for a fact when I was an art teacher teaching 7th graders to use a ruler in North Allegheny schools, and if any of you know that school district, it was no slouch of a school district. And a good many of the schools didn't know what 1/8 of an inch was. And I even tell them that, these math advisors, to say, what are you doing? What are you teaching? Well, of course, a lot of them were doing wonderful work. But it gave me an insight into what they were doing, and it gave them an insight into understanding what I was doing. It was good, too, Paul. I worked with your dad in the Department of Education, who was a reading advisor, where I did the same thing. I said, gee, you're taking up a lot of time with reading in the classroom. What is reading? Now, I'm advising you all to do that and to think about it. I don't assume that you know, but I say think about it, because after talking with Paul's dad, John, and quite a few others, and at the University of Pittsburgh, I worked with a great reading program director, Harry Sartain, and we would get into real arguments about what this is all about. And fundamentally, they would tell me that it is coding and decoding of information. And reading is really decoding. So I say, okay, here's something that a child did, or here's something that an artist did of great importance, decoded for me. And we got into real interesting conversations, and a lot more appreciation for what was happening. So from a policy point of view, to get somebody to listen to you, and for you to listen to them, very important, because it is a dialogue, it's a back and forth process. A lot of things began to happen. And I must say that although Bill would not really admit this so much, he was a powerful influence on me with regard to understanding this, because he eventually became in a very powerful position with regard to federal programs. And he headed up Title III programs, which were creative efforts, and Title I was his big effort in the department, where he was handling millions of dollars once the Johnson administration's Great Society program hit the fan. And that was back in the 1960s, when we were dealing with a lot of money to help the school districts. So from a policy point of view, that was very important. And it remains important to be clear in what it is you want, or what it is you need, and what it is you are doing. And to also make an effort, or an honest effort, to understand what others are doing.
And that was about the time they were defining the scientific process and really getting to the development of science education,
Yeah.
post-Sputnik. And so
When
there was,
Sputnik hit, that was back in the early 1960s, or excuse me, in the late 1950s. The national government set up a program called NDEA, or the National Defense Education Act. They put an awful lot of money into that to help prepare mathematics teachers and science teachers and language arts teachers, language arts, especially Russian and all these fearful languages that had to do with what was going on in the world. And that enabled a lot of teachers then to go on and get their master's and doctorate degrees in science and mathematics and so on. And those of us that were in the arts sat back and said, you know, hey, what's going on here? Somebody's paying for your education, but not mine, or, you know, helping me to really understand the importance of education. So in that, when I came to Harrisburg, that was the case. And my effort, and it was, I've got to claim that it was really sort of a personal effort when I used to say, okay, why is science so important? And the answer that usually came back to me is it had something to do with the scientific process. So you understand, you've got to understand, what is the scientific process? If I were to, you know, sit across from you right now, what would you tell me? And you wouldn't have too much trouble really coming up with the terms that describe it. And I thought to myself, well, that's pretty similar to what an artist goes through, or what somebody involved in art goes through with regard to first accentuating the process of perception, of conceptualization, coming up with an idea, moving on the idea, doing something, evaluating it, and going back. It's a cyclic process that has to do with a sense of organization. So what I did at that time was try to articulate what I was doing. And having a great fear of my own writing style at those days, I thought I better hire somebody to help me do this. So I brought in a man who was a music educator, but a powerful writer working in Washington, D.C. His name is Charles Fowler. And Charles helped to write a little booklet called The Arts Process in Basic Education. That was largely funded because there wasn't policy money in the Department of Education to publish anything, especially in the arts in those days. If you had something else in reading or science or something like that, you could get it. But in the arts, it was a far-off dream. So I had worked up a relationship with the director then of the John D. Rockefeller III Fund, and Catherine Bloom, who directed that fund, we had a nice relationship at that time, and I had agreed to help her, and she helped me. And all I had to do was pick up the telephone and she would pay for this. And so we published over 50,000 copies of the arts process in basic education. I soon found myself directing a program that was feeding programs all across the nation and internationally. There was a great impact on that because that played a large part, in my opinion, on creating eventually the arts in education. Now, the arts in education really dates back to my early work with another person who I should really pay great tribute to, was my dear colleague who's been long dead. His name is Russell Getz, who was the music advisor in the department. And because we came from different backgrounds, he was out here in the Lancaster area, in the Philadelphia area, and I was from the Pittsburgh area. And my background was zilch in music, and his background was zilch in art. And we determined to talk with one another about what we thought we knew. So at an early stage, we decided, after a lot of talk together, on doing something for the arts in education and to creating it comprehensively, because we realized then that the programs that were being developed out of Washington, D.C.'s enormous money bag, that if we were together on what we were saying and we would speak comprehensively, and we would talk about general education, and we would talk about how the arts have an impact upon general education, and we would get more money for those of you that are out there in the field. And we were a state that, in those early years that had as many as $19 million worth of grants just for arts education, because we were comprehensive in that nature. And one of the first publications we did was this one called Conversations on the Arts. And so we brought people from all over the world, Leon Carroll from Illinois, from St. Louis, Max Kaplan from Boston, Howard Conant from New York, Ronald Mitchell, another one from Wisconsin, Guy Hubbard from the University of Indiana in Bloomington. Some of you may remember Guy. Arthur Lithgow, who is the father of Lithgow, the actor right now. And he came from Princeton University. And Bennett Reamer, who was a music educator from Western Reserve in Ohio. And then Gertrude Lippincott, who was in dance. And Buckminster Fuller.
Wow, that's a major list. We are about at the end of our time, Clyde.
Yeah.
For the breakfast. People will need to move on to another session if they'd like. So we're going to take a break at the moment. And if you'd like to stick around and ask some questions and have more dialogue with Clyde, we'll do that. So let's take a little break. And
I'll stay right here.
We'll stay right here. So,
while some of you are moving out, I mentioned Buckminster Fuller. If any of you know of Buckminster Fuller, I had the gall as a young person in the department to write him a letter. He said, would you come to Harrisburg? And I was flabbergasted when he said yes. And then I worried, well, what have I committed myself to in money? And his assistant at that time was a young Japanese woman. And she made arrangements to bring Buckminster Fuller for $50 a day and to stay at the local hotel, which was unbelievable.
James has a question.
Yeah.
Quickly, as a way of closure, I had the good fortune of having some chats.
I can't hear you.
As a way of closure, I had good fortune of having some chats with Ed Matilde about the history of Pennsylvania Art Education Association.
Yeah.
All the way back to the first meetings at Bedford Springs, I think.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about the relationship between PAEA and what goes on in Harrisburg? Sometimes I think that a local teacher is so embedded in the struggle to establish the value of the arts in their own district that they don't realize necessarily that their membership in PAEA does have an effect on policy and sometimes even law. Can you talk a little bit about that just to encourage
Can I
people?
just personally respond? You've just described me. So you just described my experience for a long, long time. So thank you for that. And Go ahead. Yeah, Clyde.
Well, you're absolutely right. The Pennsylvania Art Education Association, which really doesn't go back that many years, probably 60 or 70 years.
Right, that's right.
You've got to remember, too, that the National Art Education Association had one of its major offices called Eastern Arts, located at Kutztown University. That was largely there because of the president, a man by the name of DeFrancesco, who eventually became the president of Kutztown. So he and his influence and Edmund Ziegfeld at Columbia University were strong influences in Pennsylvania with regard to how the National Art Education Association and then the Pennsylvania Art Education Association were organized. When I first came to Harrisburg, it was a pretty weak sense of organization. And I realized that when we'd hold a conference, we wouldn't have that many people, maybe there'd be 200 people or something like that. We would meet over in the Forum building, and a lot of the conversation had to be about, for teachers, how you fold paper mache or something like that. They weren't really interested so much in policy. And a lot of the things that had to do with the fundamental basics of some classroom work with regard to techniques and styles of work with materials is important because a lot of it comes along that's new. But the comradeship and everything else amongst art teachers was okay, but not as intense as it might be. But when we started to work on issues that had to do with policy, back around 1968, 69, when the state was forming the intermediate units across the state, Harry Bentz, who was the art supervisor out in the Reading School District, and I met, and we talked about how we might parallel the intermediate units in the state with units across the state with regard to PAEA. So these areas, or what do you call them now? Regions. The regions of the state at that time pretty well coincided with the intermediate units. Then that changed to be a little larger, so a little more manageable. But that helped the teachers to resolve a lot of the problems that they had at the local level, to meet and get to know one another, and then to unify a little better. That's taken a while to do that. But indeed, the relationship between PAEA, your professional association, and I might say PMEA, and the forming organizations in dance and theater, and their relationships with the Department of Education are very important. And over the years, it's had a give and take kind of a relationship. One of the things I do want to make clear, and it was always misunderstood by a good many teachers, they would think that my job in Harrisburg was to represent them, or people like yourself, to represent art educators. And I say, no, my job in Harrisburg was not to represent you. It was to represent the children in the state and see to it that they got a good education. And that they got a good education through you. And so my job was to really try to play that interactive role. And it's been over the years quite interesting and quite pleasant to remember. But there have been pitfalls, believe me. I've experienced some interesting problems over my many years working across the state and visiting most every school district. One of the things that I used to like to tell the members of PAEA was, you know where my real concerns are? It's in little towns like Renova, Pennsylvania, that's dying. Walk down the street and try to find a business that's open and so on. And then try to teach and try to tell parents that what you're teaching in art is important. And if you can't do that, you better get out of there. Because those kids deserve somebody that really knows what's going on in the world so that they don't have to just simply look forward to a life of despair. And I can say the same thing for a lot of things that are going on in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Johnstown and Scranton and wherever, including Harrisburg. So yes, the relationship is very, very important to keep that close. Right now, it's in flux. I think when Beth was here working in the department before she retired, things were pretty darn good shape in terms of relationships. But right now it is in flux, and it needs to be, we need to keep at the helm understanding what's going on with regard to the world of policy as it exists at the Department of Education level, at the legislature level.
PAEA needs to stay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, PAEA's own policies. That is what you write down. And I want to come back to the statement I made earlier about Ellis's book and Brooks' book, is that those are two books that are really well written, especially the one about Thomas Jefferson. I don't know whether you know this or not, but Thomas Jefferson did not give a State of the Union speech. Did you know that? And he was the first president to do, well, he was one of the early presidents, but he started a trend in not doing that. What he would do is he would go back and write a statement and be very, very careful with the way he crafted every word so that it would hang in there with the Congress and the legislature. And he put a great emphasis, as you know from the Declaration of Independence and other documents that he wrote, a great emphasis upon writing and speaking clearly. And so I say, so those of you that think for a moment that you don't really have a natural needed relationship to your abilities to express yourself clearly, don't hide behind, as Bill said, the stained glass window and pretend like art communicates. I don't need to talk about it, or I don't need to write about it. That's silly, because it's all a process of communication. And that process of communication with regard to the relationship of your professional organization to any other organization is built upon your abilities to talk with one another, especially outside of the realm of your profession.
So to me, this brings up an interesting relationship. You said before in schools the artist was up here, the art educator was down here, but the demands on the art educator are much stronger in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely.
Because of the diversity of abilities that you need to develop to do the things that you're talking about.
Well, and it's understandable as to what happens in the world of people with regard to what they think about themselves and how important their self-image is with regard to what it is they're doing. It's always been a kind of a lofty thing to think of yourself as an artist. And believe me, I do. I did pretty well when I was a student out at Indiana PA at IUP, but I always thought of myself as an artist and how important that was to me. And that was one of the reasons why I went on to Carnegie Mellon to get my master's degree in fine arts. My master's is in painting. And I'm very, very proud of the fact that I was one of the first persons to graduate with an MFA from that university. And they made a big deal of it because I was an art educator. They didn't expect it. But the idea of self-image of an artist is very important. We understand that. But the idea of you as an art educator, because you're sort of caught between these two professions. And I say, when I was a young teacher, my professors told me, you've got to make up your mind. You're either going to be an artist or you're going to be an art teacher. And inside myself, I said, below me, I can, it's both, the two are the same in lots of ways. Some of the greatest art educators were also artists. Think of Robert Honoree, and quite a few others, even today.
The whole Yale.
And Albers at the Black Mountain School, and then went on to Yale. Yes. Yes.
I have a question about policy. I'm the director of arts education for the school district of Philadelphia, and I am at war. I want them to realize that we have credentials and that there are policies in place that they must adhere to when it comes to the arts. So I've done a lot of research, and I'm looking back at the policies that you mentioned, and there are still things on the books regarding the elementary teachers teaching art in their contained classrooms. And then later you mentioned that there's mandated art in elementary and middle school. Where is the policy? Where can I find it to have that information at my fingertips?
The problem with what you're talking about is in the vagueness of the way a lot of that is interpreted, because it's still, an elementary teacher can still teach art legally. in the
Just
state.
within their own classroom,
Yes.
they cannot teach multiple classes.
They can
correct?
teach whatever goes on in the elementary classroom plus art and plus music.
But just
If a
in
school
their
district so
own-
desires that. But if a school district, in setting their policy, establishes policies that have to do with a youngster understanding art and participating in creative processes, et cetera, they better be prepared to show that an elementary teacher who does not have certification in art is really developing those skills and understandings at the elementary level and middle school level. The problem here, what you're talking about, is the vagueness of understanding the difference between policy and law. Policy oftentimes isn't even written down. It's just something, general understanding. In large school districts, they have to do it because of negotiation with unions, et cetera, But policy is something that is really sort of in the middle. It all depends upon how well a school board, a school superintendent, or a principal wants to implement it. And oftentimes, they can scare off people like yourselves or ourselves by simply saying, this is the way it's got to be. And if you don't press with regard to why does it have to be that way from a legal point of view, and it's just your opinion, Mr. Superintendent or Mrs. Superintendent, and this is the way you want it to be, then you better be prepared to really show your school board or your district why you're neglecting this or you're doing this in favor of that. But the school district is bound by the school laws. Now, if they break the school laws and they really don't do it, what they're supposed to be doing, then that's another case. But even that is pretty rough. If they're not offering art, for example, at the secondary level, then that's against the law. If they're not handling it properly at the middle school and junior high level, that's against the law. But if they're handling it at the elementary level and having elementary teachers do it as they say, it's pretty vague and remains vague. And that was a necessary evil at the time because, as I told you, the beginnings of art education, there weren't a number of teachers to fill the job. And to be a certified art teacher in the 1930s, that was a big deal. In the 1940s and even into the 1950s. So, we're still trying to recover from that and to sort of learn how important it is to get people that know what they're doing with regard to education in the arts. Now, that leads me to one other thing that, I have to say this, and please listen to it from an understanding point of view. We don't want to be touting quality arts education and not be able to deliver it. And a lot of people hide behind that and really, quite frankly, don't know what they're doing in the classroom. And so I say that to all of us, whether you're at college or university level or you're deep in on the firing line with regard to Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or wherever you are, the most important thing is to strive to prepare and to deliver quality work. And you know what that is. I mean, nobody needs to lecture you on that, especially you folks. But I'm sick and tired of knowing that an art teacher is driving to work and waiting at the red light and trying to figure out what they're going to teach that day.
Or with what?
Or shooting the curriculum arrow into the air and wherever it falls, drawing the target around it. There's a lot of that goes on in the classroom, and sometimes it can work. The spur of the moment, thinking of something different, or you're fitting something to a particular student, or this particular classroom, or a particular situation in the school district. I can understand where something on a spontaneous level occurs and happens. But there's no excuse for not really being prepared. And a prepared person also understands all of the processes which have to do with policy. because you yourselves, as an art educator, form policy. And the way you conduct yourself, that's all a part of your personal policy. In your department, is your policy to work together? If you're a secondary teacher, do you know what's going on at the elementary level? Or do you know what's going on in the superintendent's office or whatever? So that's very important, which reminds me, I want to call your attention to a publication that's really occurring through the Arts and Education Initiative of the Education Policy and Leadership Center. And this document on policy is very important. If you don't have a copy of it, I have a couple copies up here, three of them left, and you may have them. But the source is the Education Policy and Leadership Center here in Harrisburg. I happen to be on that board and very proud to be, because that document is very important. I would also encourage you to do some digging with regard to some of the documents that we produce thousands of. I was shocked yesterday when I went into my own library and tried to find a copy of the arts process in basic education. I called Mary Lou and I said, do you have a copy? And she says, I probably do, but it's off in a file somewhere. And believe me, I told you, we printed over 50,000 copies of that, plus many, many, many copies of a curriculum called Concepts Through Process, which, you know, look these up. They should be in your local library or at least accessible through Google. I was able to Google the document and find it. But it's better to have that, in my opinion, that hard copy right in your hot little hands to read it and understand where we were coming from. Any other questions of that sort? Yes.
Clyde, tell everyone how you work with the Rockefellers and with the Getty to help further it at the national level, and the impact actually from Pennsylvania, because I think we held leadership positions at both NAEA and in those other realms.
Well, the arts education was always an issue, but a vague issue with the Ford Foundation, with the Carnegie Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation, especially the John D. Rockefeller III Fund. I've been fortunate, and the Getty Foundation, I've been fortunate enough to be either on their advisory boards or directly on their boards of all those organizations. And it really began, a good bit of it, with regard to an impact on arts education through the Rockefeller Fund, the John D. Rockefeller III Fund. And his relationship to the Federation of Women's Clubs, believe it or not, which was organized, and I think they were headquartered in New York City and Washington, D.C. And Mr. Rockefeller, John Rockefeller III, sought out a woman by the name of Catherine Bloom, who at the time was working in New York City with the women's clubs and the League of Women. Anyhow, they had a program that included a lot of prints and taking prints of artwork to schools, or whether you know that or not. So he sought her out because Mr. Rockefeller, who was a marvelous man and quite an intellect, was in the process of writing a book that he called the Revolution in the Second American Revolution, and it had to do with education. And a lot of it was based upon what he saw happening in arts education, believe it or not. And the title of that book is The Second American Revolution. I have a copy of it. I don't know how popular it was with regard to libraries, but anyhow, he hired Catherine Bloom to head up a new foundation called the John D. Rockefeller III Fund. And at that time, Catherine, who was working with the women's group, had sought a position with the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., which then had a program in arts and humanities. So he stole her out of that operation and brought her to New York to head up the program and funded the program heavily. So the John D. Rockefeller III Fund was one of the first to really start investing in art education. Now the problem was, how did they spend their money? And let me explain that. I became very good friends with Catherine, because she had heard that I was trying to do some things in Pennsylvania and was apparently impressed. And she wanted me to work with her, and I told her I couldn't because of my family situation. So we worked out a relationship where I would stay in Harrisburg and work for the Department of Education, and she would fund my programs. But how could she fund them? Because if she gave money to my program, to me, as a member of the state government, that money would have to go into the general fund. So what I did was create a foundation here. The foundation had to do with arts education. And we created that here in Harrisburg. And the local attorney who was working with us in the Department of Education agreed to be on that board and to help us organize it. And the money flowed through that organization, but it was very loose for me to be able to print documents like this and the arts process in basic education, and to send me and other people that I wanted to work with to various conferences around the world. So it really gave us quite an advantage. Well, in addition to that, there were people like Junius Eddy and others who were working with the Ford Foundation in New York. And all these folks in the foundation world were all sort of close together. They'd have lunch together and whatever. And so they got to know one another. So Junius invited me to be a part of the Ford Foundation program, and then eventually the Carnegie Foundation advisory. And we got to talk about various things we wanted to happen in arts education. The only way that they worked with us was funding through some of the college programs and some of the local programs. They never really ended up giving any money through state government or directly to teachers as I knew it. They might sing a lot of program that was exceptional and funded. Then the Getty program was somewhat similar. There was a woman by the name of Lonnie Latine Duke, who a wonderful woman who's now working with the American Crafts Council. She's on that board. But she was hired by the Getty Foundation, and Lonnie knew of my work here in Harrisburg, and she came out to Harrisburg and interviewed me on what we were trying to do at the time, and went back to California and then offered me an opportunity to be a part of the Getty program. But all those programs had tremendous impact on arts education one way or another. The Getty program has sort of backed off of a lot of that for any of a variety of reasons. If any of you follow what's going on with the Getty, you'll understand it a little better. But the foundation world plays a big role. Now presently, for example, even the publication of this is funded largely through monies that come from the Heinz Foundation and the Hillman Foundation out in Pittsburgh. And another foundation based in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Foundation, really has put money into that organization. So that is growing, and the reason it is growing is because they have a pretty darn good idea that arts education plays a significant role in changing education for the better in today's world. And they want to see more results. They know what's going on. They are leery in many instances about what happens to the programs as they sort of dissipate and are confused as they move from one issue to another over the course of years. I know that that's been happening in art education lately. It's hard to keep in touch with what's happening. I know for a few years we were very interested in discipline-based arts education. I think now the emphasis is on design education and a lot of that. But it's very important for us to keep, for policy reasons that we wish to influence outside of the realm of our profession, is to keep some core consistent as about what it is we're trying to do. We don't want to fight within ourselves as to how we're going to go about serving our cause in arts education. I still see some of that happening. You're either with us in design education or you're doing something else. You know, work to keep it reasonably consistent. If you don't, you'll be perceived as an organization that's all over the place. And we're not going to bother with you, so to speak. So from a policy point of view, the impact of foundations is extremely important nowadays when budgets are so tight at the state level and no doubt at the local level. As long as, I say this to any art educator, if you have a good, strong program and you can articulate it, you're willing to stand up for it you won't have too many problems. If you're not afraid to stand up from a policy point of view and challenge issues and know what you're talking about, and I'm not talking about being angry and going in and threatening somebody, but I am talking about when you're sitting across the table, you are an intellectual equal, and you know what you're doing with regard to the service to the youngsters that you're responsible for. Keep in mind, I think, keep in mind that your work in arts education is not only unique, but in my personal opinion, it is really noble. It really is. You're working at the vanguard of things that education nowadays really ought to be about. It's not only understanding issues and preparing people to act on issues, but to include in their actions a sense of heart, a sense of feelings, a sense of empathy for others. And that goes across the world, believe me. And that's why I think what we're doing is so important.
Great. Thank you very much. I think on that note, we're going to end because it's a high note for us.